Dr. Bill Harris, thank you so much for doing this. It's really
My
kind.
pleasure.
We have been, or Eloise and I, producer Eloise and I, have been long-term users of fish oil and omega-3. Just to set the stage, I'm sure you hear terms being thrown around interchangeably. When you hear omega-3 and when people hear fish oil, what are they thinking? Are they referring to the same thing? Could you just clear up the vernacular that people use?
Sure. Yeah, fish oils, right? That's the vernacular. The reason fish oils are helpful, useful, why anybody cares about them is because they contain omega-3 fatty acids, among others. But they are the primary source of the two most important omega-3s, which are called EPA and DHA.
Okay.
When people use the term omega-3, particularly in marketing, they will sometimes kind of pull a switch and include ALA, alpha linolenic acid, which is chemically speaking a omega-3 fatty acid, but it is poorly converted. It's a shorter, simpler molecule than EPA and DHA. It's poorly converted in the body to EPA and DHA. It's not equivalent. It's not a substitute for the fish oil omega-3s. When I talk about omega-3, and I think, Ben, when you talk about it, we'll mean EPA and DHA.
Okay,
not
right. So when people hear fish oil, the main thing they need to think about is it contains omega-3, and the two types of omega-3 that actually warrant any conversation about are EPA and DHA. I got that right?
Right.
Okay,
right.
Great. I think that sets the stage well, because a few questions before we had this was, can you just define what these things are? Because we need to know. So before we get into it properly, Dr. Harris, I'd love to understand, if people don't know about omega-3, as somebody who studied it the last 40 years, why should they tune in?
Well, if they care about their health, they should tune in because these fatty acids are important for optimal health. That's the primary reason. Most people in the Western world, pretty much people outside of Korea and South Korea and Japan and Greenland, perhaps, are low in omega-3 fatty acids, below optimal levels. And so for doing all you can to improve your health and your health span, as we say, getting your omega fatty acids into your diet and into your blood, more importantly, is a job number one. We think that's very important.
It was interesting in the prep for this. There was a Harvard study, I think it was 2009. It was before, it wasn't so recent, and it said there's 6 modifiable risk factors to prevent death, and in them was avoid pollution. One of them was make sure you have enough omega-3, specifically EPA and DHA. Are you familiar with that study?
Yeah, right. It's the determinants of health, I think it is.
Tell us about that. Love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I agree. The evidence is even stronger now than it was back when that paper was written in 10, 15 years ago. Because now we have better data showing that high omega-3 levels are clearly associated with a longer lifespan. Or you could flip it around the other way and say low omega-3 is a predictor of a premature death. That makes perfect sense when you're talking about the global determinants of health and lifespan.
It's a really interesting one because it's not something people would think about who don't necessarily fall on the spectrum of I have agency over my health, and actually think it's more determined. And to people who aren't familiar with supplementation and maybe are sort of new to the health world, do you have to supplement, or can you just get enough EPA and DHA from your diet?
Yes, you can get enough EPA and DHA from your diet. You will need to eat fish, particularly what we call the SMASH fish, SMASH, which includes salmon. I think albacore tuna is SM. Mackerel, right? Anchovies. Nobody eats anchovies except a little bit on a Caesar salad, and then you throw them away. Albacore tuna is a good one for the A. S would be sardines. H, herring. Those kinds of oily fish. Salmon is probably the easiest one to get, followed by sardines. Those are the ones that are richest in omega-3. There's many fish that we eat are very low in omega-3. Your classic fish and chips made with cod very little omega-3 in that particular type of fish. It's still a good choice. I'm not sure that deep fried cod is a great choice, but you know what I'm saying here.
Depends on your
The omega-3 part of it is not good in those types of fish. And shrimp is very little omega-3. Lobster is very little omega-3 because they're very low fat, high protein products. It's not to diss them, but yeah. You can do it with fish. It probably takes about a serving every other day to get to the levels that we think are healthy.
Right. Okay. I mean, I don't think in the Western world people hit nearly as much as that. As far as like intake of salmon and actually fish. I've heard a rule that the smaller the fish, the higher the concentrations of fatty acids usually, is a rule of thumb.
As a rule of thumb, it's not bad. That's not bad. Yeah,
could be better.
I'm sure there are exceptions, but it's probably simpler than trying to remember. What do you do with salmon? It's about the same size as codfish.
Sure. Okay.
But anyway, yeah.
So, Bill, you've studied this for 40 years, maybe a bit longer now, and 40 years ago it wasn't all the rage as it is now, and there wasn't this funding going into the research, and it was sort of a bit. So my research says it was a bit of off consensus. It wasn't the main thing to study. So how did you fall into it? I fell
into it by being assigned by I got my PhD. Then after a PhD, you do what's called a postdoctoral fellowship, which is your first experience as trying to become an independent researcher. And my PhD was in nutrition. I picked a group to go study with in my postdoctoral work with Dr. Bill Connor in Portland, Oregon, and he was interested in those days, cholesterol levels. That was all the rage. And he was very curious about, we knew about plant oils, that they lowered cholesterol. We knew that saturated fats, hard fats from animals, pork, beef, raised cholesterol levels. But we didn't really know why, and we didn't know if it was because those vegetable oils are liquid at room temperature and the animal fats are solid at room temperature. That's a kind of a chemical thing? Is that why they raise cholesterol? Or is it the fact if there's some innate feature of animalness or plantness that will cause cholesterol levels to go up and down? Well, we didn't know. And so Dr. Connor had the idea, well, let's study salmon oil because it comes from a fish. It comes from an animal, but it's liquid. And so my assignment was to do a study on what's the effect of salmon oil on blood cholesterol and blood triglyceride levels. And that was and I guess I got that assignment. And we did a study in volunteers, fed them a whole bunch of salmon oil and compared it to other diets. And we found that, the salmon oil lowered cholesterol just like the vegetable oils did. What we also found, which was novel, was that triglyceride levels, the other blood lipid besides cholesterol, went down as well. And that was kind of the beginning of the whole fish oils lower triglyceride story.
Okay, wonderful. And that was sort of the cascade of all the health benefits we know about today and all the millions of dollars of research.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say we weren't the first to do this. There were a lot of folks in England and Europe beginning to do this too. In fact, the first omega-3 concentrate, it was called a concentrate in those days, was made by 7 Seas Health in Hull, England. And that was what we called Max EPA, which was about 30% EPA and DHA compared to salmon oil, which is like 19% EPA and DHA. So 30% was a big deal in those days.
I think it does need a rebrand, especially in the UK, because when people hear fish oil, they think 7 Seas back in early 80s.
They think cod liver oil.
They do think cod liver oil, yes, and they think being forced it as kids and they don't want anything about it. So I think reconnecting with a reason why to take, or actually to explore getting more fish into your diet, or to even to take it in supplement form, is interesting. It's kind of where I want to go with this conversation today. You've spent a lot of time of Omega-3. Tell us about them. I'd love to dive into that.
Yeah, that's really where the story first showed up, that omega-3s might be connected with cardiovascular disease. And those flowed out of studies in the 1970s. Danish researchers, Dr. Dyerberg and Dr. Bang, were very interested in a group of Eskimos or Inuits in Greenland. Greenland was essentially a county of Denmark in those days. So the Danes were connected with them. And these physicians knew that there was at least some evidence that there was very little cardiovascular disease among these Inuit people living off the sea, basically. However, their diet was, by 1970 standards, terrible. I mean, it didn't have any fruits and vegetables in it, nothing fresh in it. It was all meat and high cholesterol and high saturated fat and everything that's supposed to kill you. But on the other hand, these guys were doing fine. And so that intrigued these Danish investigators. So they went over, met these people, drew blood, took samples of food, analyzed it. They discovered these unusual fatty acids in not only the blood, but also the food of these Eskimos, which were the Omega-3s. Now, these fatty acids have been known since the 50s, but just nobody knew there was any health relationship to them. And so the Dyerberg and Bang kind of came upon the idea that the Omega-3s are acting. Actually, this is the same time that prostaglandins were being discovered. And Dyerberg and Bang knew the guy, Samuelson, who had figured out the prostaglandins. And they realized that EPA was a molecule that can be converted to prostaglandins, just like arachidonic acid, which everybody else knew about.
Just could you define what those terms are? Could you just explain it? Then you want to.
Sure. Prostaglandins are molecules that we make from fatty acids in our body, make them from both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, the two polyunsaturated fatty acid families in our diet. And prostaglandins are very active molecules. They appear quickly, do their job, and then disappear. So they're made sort of on demand. And there are many different kinds of them. And they were just discovered, again, in the 19s. People didn't know what these things were. Now we have drugs that mimic them. But at the time, the discovery of the prostaglandins, and they were first discovered in the prostate gland of I think some rabbits or some animal. In any event, that's how they got their name. But they come from omega-6 and omega-3. They typically come from the major omega-6, which is called arachidonic acid, which is a 20-carbon fatty acid, 20 carbons long, and it has 4 double bonds, which specific to that structure. The EPA, with the omega-3 we're talking about here, is 20 carbons long and has 5 double bonds. And it can also be made into prostaglandins. And they just have the ones that are made from the omega-6 have very different activity than the ones that are made from the omega-3, which are much more benign, and they don't cause platelet aggregation, blood clotting, as much as the omega-6s do. So, in fact, that was the original hypothesis from these Danish investigators when they studied the heart disease rates in Inuits, was that the EPA in the diet and in the blood was replacing this omega-6 fatty acid, arachidonic acid, and making the blood less likely to clot. So in those days, we believed heart attacks were primarily caused by blood clots in the heart. If you could block, which is why we take aspirin, to reduce the risk for blood clots. And so they found that this oil from fish and from whale and from seal, which is what they ate, had this molecule in it that blunted down the whole blood clotting system. And they thought that was the reason why the omega-3s were reducing risk for heart attacks. But that's where the link with omega-3 cardiovascular disease started in the 1970s with the Eskimo studies.
So if we stay on the cardiovascular theme, that's the conclusion of that study. Where have we got to today from a cardiovascular point of view and omega-3s?
Oh, many, many more things. We've learned that the omega, in exploring why they protect against heart attacks, we've discovered that they have a effect of calming it's kind of difficult to explain, reducing risk for what they call sudden cardiac arrest. A sudden cardiac arrest is a heart attack, but it's a bad one. It's one that throws the heart acutely into a chaotic rhythm. It's not beating right at all. It's not beating rhythmically. It's just kind of quivering. And a quivering heart pumps no blood. And as soon as that happens, you go unconscious, and within a few minutes, you're dead. That's sudden cardiac death. And the omega-3s have property, when they become incorporated into the electrical tissues of the heart, they make that sudden cardiac arrest less likely to happen. They allow the rhythms to remain normal longer. So that's a big step from understanding. So that's not blood clotting at all. It has nothing to do with blood clotting. They do help make the blood thinner and reduce risk for blood clots, but they also have this effect to reduce the risk for what we call ventricular arrhythmias, which are bad ones. Also, slower the heart. They slow the heart rate down, chronically drop it by 1 or 2 beats per minute, which over time adds up, and that's part of affecting probably the autonomic nervous system. So they do that too. They also have a lowering effect on blood pressure, which is part of the cardiovascular system as well that we didn't know about from Greenland studies. So we've learned a lot.
I mean, it's amazing just from the cardiovascular benefits there. I mean, there's a few different proposed mechanisms, right? As opposed to you're lowering your blood pressure. If you have lower blood pressure, you're vastly less likely to die of heart disease. And I think heart disease in America is the #1 cause of death, if I'm right in saying. I think in the UK it's second. Heart disease is...
Cardiovascular, right. It depends on how widely you define cardiovascular disease, but
right.
Yeah, certainly cancer and heart disease are competing. Cancer more early in life, heart disease more late in life. But if you're counting bodies, no matter what the age, cardiovascular disease, I think, is still edging out cancer.
Okay. And so this benefit for the listener at home, and they've just heard you say that you can reduce the risk of these fatal heart attacks, essentially. Is it significant enough to warrant incorporating this into your diet? Is it significant enough to warrant supplementing this?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just that. We've done studies where we looked at blood omega-3 levels in large populations, and we find that the people that have the highest omega-3 levels, because they eat the most omega-3, whether supplements or eating fish, they're also at lower risk for dying from cancer, at lower risk for dying from, if you actually look at the causes of death that people in nationwide data. We split it out into cardiovascular death, cancer death, and then everything else. So it's kind of a third. We find that having higher omega-3 reduces your risk from death from all 3 of those things. So it's not just cardiovascular disease that you get benefits from, because the omega-3s are really helping to fine-tune the cellular metabolism all through the body, every tissue, and reducing inflammation, which we'll probably get to later, Ben. But that's one of the other major benefits of omega-3. So, is it worth it to reduce your omega-3, your risk for death from all causes? Sure, it is. Especially when there's no risk involved. We're not talking about a drug that has side effects. We're talking about a nutrient.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's so. There's so many different ways you could look at this, so many different lenses you could look at omega-3, right? I mean, you touched on inflammation. I think we should dive straight into that, because that's another whole mechanism to even attack, right? High inflammation, as a rule of thumb, not good, right? So tell us about the anti-inflammatory effects of omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, it's another pillar of their mechanism of action. And we're all concerned. We know that inflammation in an acute setting, when you get an infection, is an important thing, an important system your body's been designed to react to and eliminate. What we don't like is a kind of what we call chronic inflammation, low-level chronic inflammation that never goes away. That is what is characteristic pretty much of the Western diet and lifestyle. And that's the thing that the omega-3s will suppress. There are actually active mechanisms in the body that once you have an inflammatory stimulus of some kind, something that would cause your inflammatory system to go, it needs to turn off. And what the omega-3s do is they help turn it off. It goes up just fine, but if you haven't got enough omega-3 on it, it just kind of stays up. But when you have the omega-3s, it will bring it right back down to normal. That's what we want. That's homeostasis, bringing things back to normal. And the omega-3s do that. And they do it by complicated mechanisms, partly related to this whole prostaglandin thing, and other molecules that are like that the omega-3s are made into. But the omega-3s also live, should we say, in the body in cell membranes. Every cell has a membrane. Every membrane is made up of lipids, mostly phospholipids, and those phospholipids contain a bunch of fatty acids, but that's where the omega-3s live.
It's and
really so anyway, by virtue of what they do to the physical properties of cell membranes, they make the cells work better. The stuff that is supposed to go out of the cell goes out better. The stuff that's supposed to come into the cell comes in better, and you don't have the trash accumulating inside the cell when it shouldn't be there, because the omega-3s are helping the membrane open and close properly.
It's a really interesting nod to our past, our evolutionary past, of why do our bodies react so well to this kind of diet, and why do we need higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids? I mean, it's a nod to sort of how we were meant to be.
Yeah, I think we're meant to eat fish.
Yeah, it seems.
I mean, well, one of the most important things of anybody's diet is having water. You can't live without water. So every civilization that's ever grown up has grown up around water. And what lives in water? Duh. Okay, yeah. They come together. So as much as we need water, we need omega-3s. That's probably a little strong, but you know what I mean.
Yes, I do. And doing this podcast is really fun because we get to speak with really smart people like yourself. And a lot of the time, it's the answers to optimal health or whatever it is. It's going back to the basics of that evolutionary parts. Walk more, get more sunlight, be outdoors more. Be more in tune with our evolutionary past. And if that was eating more fish, then we're getting into a lot of the benefits of having a higher omega-3 index,
right,
or higher omega-3 levels in your blood. One before I want to ask about how we check our levels, and I want to go down that rabbit hole as well. Before we do, I'd like to talk about BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a real amazing thing to try and optimize your levels of. How I'm aware omega-3 fatty acids can increase that in the brain. Could you just give us a summary of what it is and why it's important and how omega-3s act on that?
Honestly, I don't know a lot about BDNF. I know what it means.
Okay.
I know omega-3s raise it. I know it's a good thing for neurocognitive health, but I don't know how omega-3s raise it. So anyway, I'll just have to plead some ignorance there.
No, all good.
Haven't been down that road that much.
No, all good. It's pretty niche. I mean, the sort of proposed, and again, I'm pleading ignorance. This is just from my prep. The proposed is omega-3s raise it somehow, and higher levels of BDNF in the brain and the blood result in lower rates of Alzheimer's, can have better cognition, better memory, better neurogenesis, better neuroplasticity as well. Just another thing towards omega-3 fatty acids as to why take note and why listen.
Yeah, and maybe just to jump back, I don't mean to interrupt you, but you were talking about before we kind of got on the live feed here, we were talking about new studies that have come out recently. And I'd forgotten to mention, but one of the new studies that has just recently come out, 2 papers supporting the same thing, has to do with what we call the good cholesterol, HDL, high-density lipoproteins. Of course, in the blood, we have the bad cholesterol. I hate to say that because cholesterol is cholesterol. It's not good or bad. But the particles that are rich in cholesterol, called low-density lipoproteins, are bad. The ones that are called high-density lipoproteins that also contain cholesterol are good. But we don't really know why they're good until a couple of recent papers with omega-3 have shown that the ability of those HDL good particles to transport cholesterol from the tissues to the liver for excretion is enhanced when you're on a high omega-3 diet. So the actual function of those HDL particles, their functionality is improved and toward an anti-atherosclerotic direction when you have a high omega-3. And so that's a new additional mechanism by which we think the omega-3s protect against vascular disease. Anyway, we were at Alzheimer's disease when I just thought of that.
Well, I mean, the proposed. I mean, we were speaking with someone the other day where, you mentioned vascular disease and Alzheimer's. The new proposed.
Yep.
Alzheimer's is a vascular disease. Why do PDE5 inhibitors help with Alzheimer's and vascular disease. So inevitably, everything is connected to everything else.
Right.
Various different tangents. So I'm pretty sure, I mean, if you're not sold on why you should eat more fish, or maybe consider supplementing with an omega-3 supplement, by now, I mean, I don't know what else would convince you.
I don't know. Right. Go to another channel.
Yeah, exactly.
Give it up.
So how do you know if your levels are okay? How do you know if your levels are optimal? How do we test that in the body or blood and or
what? Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, you can't just look in the mirror and see it in your eyes. You've got to actually do a blood test. And now, 20 years ago, this year, we developed a blood test we call the Omega-3 index. And it was it's expressed as a percent, the Omega-3 index is, and it's a percent of the fatty acids in a red blood cell membrane. I remember I mentioned all cells have membranes, and membranes are made up of these fats. And the omega-3s are in these membranes, and the easiest cell to actually measure in the laboratory is a red blood cell, because that comes with basically half of your blood is red cells, and the other half is what we call plasma or serum. So we can isolate the red blood cells very easily, and we analyze the amount of EPA and DHA in the red cells and express it as a percent of the total fatty acids in the membranes. And that will usually range on the low end from maybe 2% up to 10 or 12%. That's sort of the worldwide range of omega-3 index levels. In the UK, the US, roughly 5%, 5.5% is pretty typical. 8% is what we think the threshold for optimality, best omega-3, 8 to 12% is what we like to recommend, where the omega-3 index is. So it's a easy blood test. It's actually doable with a dry, by pricking your finger, which I think you have some recent experience with.
We did.
Drop on the paper.
We did. We absolutely did. And, thank you so much for sending them. They were really, really fun to do. Eloise, do you mind if I use you as a bit of an example and go through yours?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we got these done on the 4th of April. And I think for about, since the beginning of this year, I mean, Eloise and I eat relatively a good amount of fish, probably salmon twice, 3 times a week, something like that. And you had started supplementing as well. Okay, so recent intake of supplementing from omega-3 fatty acids. And it's a good supplement by all accounts. It had quite high EPA, quite high DHA. We'll get onto that in a second. So Eloise's omega-3 index was 9.
Excellent.
How are we doing? We're good?
Beautiful. That's the same as mine.
There you go. You've heard it from the man himself.
Well, yeah, 10% is what I try to keep, but over 8% is fantastic. I mean, what we've seen in our studies is 95% of people outside, again, of those very high omega-3 countries are 95% or below that 8%. So she's doing something good. Hopefully your sample will come back as well.
Hopefully. I mean, I can't work it out. She's sort of like Benjamin Button, I get older and she looks younger. So it's not it's not working out, but yeah, whatever. We might have to stop her taking all this omega-3. But so the average in the UK was around 5%, which according to this, and it's suboptimal, right? So it seems like quite an easy fix to get it up towards optimal levels. How long would that take?
It generally would take, if you take the scenario of somebody who's starting out baseline at 5% omega-3 index, and they say, oh, I need to be higher. Well, how much should I take? How much should I take, and how long should I take it before I retest? So you want to test again after you've reached a new steady state, because for a while your levels are going to go up if you start supplementing, and eventually it'll level off. And that's when you want to measure again. And that's roughly 3 to 4 months after you make a change. How much do you need? In our studies, if you're wanting to get 50% of the people, put it this way, on average, you can get to 8% in half the people, going from 5% with about 1,400 milligrams a day of EPA and DHA as a triglyceride.
Could you explain what that means?
Yeah, because the omega-3 fatty acids can come in several different forms, chemical forms. There are some omega-3 pharmaceutical products, omega-3 based pharmaceutical products, and they're all in what they call the ethyl ester form, which means there's a molecule of ethanol, alcohol, attached to each omega-3. And then in that form, you can pack a lot of omega-3 in a little capsule. You've only got so much room inside a capsule for products, and the omega-3 is packed the tightest that way. A triglyceride is an oil. I mean, think vegetable oil, think butter. Those are all triglycerides. Those are all, and the reason one is liquid and one solid is the different fatty acids that are included in the triglyceride. Triglyceride means three fatty acids on a glycerol backbone, so it's triglyceride, and that's a common form of omega. And typically and that's more readily absorbed than the ethyl ester form. Ethyl ester form, in order to be absorbed well, has to be taken with food.
Right.
And triglyceride forms, yeah, not so much.
Because it's fat soluble and you need to have it. I mean, it is a fat, right? I don't understand why you're pairing it with it. Okay, understood.
Right.
It segues quite nicely. So in the OmegaQuant report, which is amazing, and I've really enjoyed doing it, and it's awesome to actually read through the report. At the top, there's the omega-3 index. Then you go down, it's the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, I think it is. Then you've got the EPA, and at the very bottom, you've got your trans fat index. I'd love to, could you just a brief summary on just what those other variables are? The
Sure.
trans fat reminded me.
Yeah, when we do an analysis of for the omega-3 index, analyze the red blood cells or dried blood spot, we get a wide variety of fatty acids that are there. And again, the one we think is most important is EPA and DHA. So that's our flagship test. But we can derive other information from this analysis. And one of the things is the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which is all the omega-6 fatty acids divided by all the omega-3 fatty acids. That's a metric some people have come to like. I'm not a big fan of it myself. I'd much prefer the omega-3 index because that's EPA and DHA. And I think the getting distracted with the omega-6 fatty acids is probably not helpful in focusing on the omega-3s. EPA, or arachidonic acid to EPA ratio, is also one that was popularized by Barry Sears, who's a major researcher and force in the omega-3 world. He likes that as kind of an inflammation index. That's fine. We provide it for people. The trans fat index is interesting because most people know what trans fats are. They're, like in fried donuts and cookies and lots of industrially produced products. And we're trying to get rid of them. Most governments around the world are now trying to ban them because we know they're bad for your heart. But they're still lingering around in our bodies because we've eaten them for years. And so that's one of the tests that we are able to do is measure how much of the trans fats are in your blood. So those are the other three ratio type things that we provide.
Okay, interesting. I mean, Eloise is firmly in the desirable range on the trans fat index.
Good.
She'll be delighted to hear, I'm sure, as am I. It's such an interesting test, and I think more and more people, we like to call it the sort of the spectrum agency of where you fall on how malleable your health is. Very far left, I can do nothing. Very far right, I have lots in my hands I can control, and mold. And I think more and more people are falling onto that right side of the spectrum. And something like this is, I think, only going to go one way with more interest over the next coming years. So definitely do check that out. Could they find this online if they typed in OmegaQuant? Could they get this done?
Right. You type in omega-3 index test, type in OmegaQuant. That's the name of our laboratory, OMEGA and QUANT, like quantity, OmegaQuant.com. Either of those should get you to a page where you can order a dried blood spot test. Kit sent to your house. You prick your finger, mail it back in an envelope, and then you get a report, hopefully within about a week after it shows up in the lab.
It's really good. You want to come in with something?
I was just going to say that there's a really helpful calculator as well, which when you've done your test, I found really helpful. I could enter in my omega-3 index, and it spat out what I would need to supplement with a supplement in order to either maintain or get up to a different percentage, which I found incredibly helpful. So even though, 10%. If I wanted to get to 11%, I found that I'd have to supplement with something like per day, which I found really interesting. So there's actually actionable information at hand that's tailored specific to your results, which I found very, very
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, well, Eloise up there at 10%. If she puts her value in the calculator, it's going to explode.
Yeah.
Calculator is designed to get people up to 8%. And so when you're over the top, it goes, ah!
Yeah.
I don't know what to do.
You'll freak it out, okay? You'll freak it out.
Freak it out. But yeah, it's true. We do have a link to a evidence-based, based on a paper we've published that allows you, if you're below 8, you can put your number, whatever it is, in the calculator, and it'll spit out what, on average, everybody's different. That's why we test. So it gives you an idea of where to start, and that's the idea of that.
I mean, there's a fun before and after test there for lots of people listening. But we'll put the link in the show notes, and people can check it out. It's
great.
Yeah, really, really fun thing to do. I mean, the problem with a topic like this is there's so many different segues to go with. I mean, I'm looking at my notes, and I've got Omega-3 may increase levels of arginine, boosting nitric oxide production in the blood. Pretty recent study. I don't know if you've come across that one.
I mean, we studied that back in the 90s.
That's old news.
And I mean, I have not seen a recent paper on omega-3 and nitric oxide, but I'll look at it. I'll look for it now. Or you can send me a link, Ben, when we're done.
Yeah, sure.
I'd like to know what that paper's about, because that is yet another mechanism of action where the omega-3s help the blood vessels to be more relaxed.
Okay.
Less stiff, which plays into the blood pressure thing too.
So yeah, sort of, it seems like the mechanism is sort of the endothelial function, right? So
right,
which is super interesting. I mean, there's another one here: higher fish and omega-3 intake linked to a 12% lower hip fracture risk, which is amazing. What if you could hazard a guess to the mechanism of that? What would be that?
Well, I'd like to know in that study if it's a reduction in risk of hip fracture or a reduction in risk for falling. Because if you don't fall, you don't break your hip.
That's true.
I'm not surprised that there is that relationship between high omega-3 and hip fractures, lower hip fractures. The mechanism is the question, whether the bone is actually stronger, which would be possible. It's also possible that having a higher omega makes you what we'll call less frail, better balance, better able to walk. If you don't fall down, you don't break your hip. So if a high omega-3 could be part of the ability to resist a fall when you trip, just because your muscle tone, we have a sense in our body of what we call proprioception, where we know where we are when our eyes are closed, which is pretty amazing. So in any event, that link with omega-3 and fractures is interesting, and I'm not exactly sure the mechanism.
Okay, I mean, there's lots of these ones as well, which again, I'm not going to bring them all up because of the I don't know if the efficacy is as much as you do, but of the study, that is. Tell us about the UK Biobank work.
Right. The UK Biobank, you folks there in the UK, I'm sure you had nothing probably to do with it, but 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, some smart people over there said, let's amass a large number of people from the UK and do a people between age 40 and 69. And we're going to do a physical exam. We're going to take a blood sample. We're going to ask 1,000 questions about their health and their habits. And then we're going to put all that data in a biobank or in a data bank. And then they put the blood in a biobank freezer. And it's now been analyzed by a group in Finland called Nightingale. So, or at least half of it has. The rest of it's we're waiting for. But it's what we call an observational cohort study. So nobody in this, it's almost 500,000 people. And again, it was done in the recently I heard, we call them the 90s, we call them the 80s, the 70s. What do you call the zeros? Well,
the noughties, apparently.
The noughties is what I heard too. I'd never heard that before. I loved it. So in the noughties, they started the study, and now we're in 2024, and it's been 12, 15 years, and people they're dying, they're having diseases develop. And so we can look back at the blood levels of omega-3, which is our interest, that they reported, and see, based on their blood level then, what happened to them. And when we do that, the people who have the highest blood omega-3 levels are the least likely to have developed disease by this time, whether it's death, which is a bad disease, or heart attacks, strokes, right? Diabetes, variety of conditions, cancer. So that's what the UK Biobank, and it's people are looking at using this data. Thankfully it's available, essential. Well, not exactly free, but reasonable for the amount of the richness of that data set. Is a lot of people around the world are studying it and publishing all kinds of things. We're focused on the omega-3 and the omega-6 fatty acids and their relationships with health outcomes.
The pushback a lot of people would maybe have on that is, okay, well, was the study large? Were there enough people in the study? Yes. I mean, over 500,000 people. And did it go on for a significant amount of time? Yes. So was it up to 14 years, right? So you can go through the study on the sort of, large relevant sample size and try to critique the study. And obviously nothing's perfect, but it's pretty great. And I think, the findings seem really quite
yeah, I mean, there are people who said, well, it's not exactly, people have to volunteer to be in it. So right away, some people aren't going to volunteer. And so maybe it's not going to be perfectly reflective of all UK citizens. Fair enough. That's true of every study that anybody has to volunteer for. People who don't volunteer don't get in them. But the general idea is what relationships between, in our case, omega-3 levels and health outcomes should apply widely, even if it's not perfectly representative of the UK. We looked at this relationship between omega-3 levels and risk for death in a previous study 2-3 years ago that included about 12, 15 countries, not nearly as many people as in the UK Biobank, but the same idea. We looked at omega-3 level and risk for death in all these different countries and found that, again, the higher the omega-3, the lower the risk. Then we did the same thing in the UK Biobank, and it gave us exactly the same answer. So it's generalizable. It's the term we use. You can generalize it to the wider population.
I mean, if something like that can be replicated as it has done, ears should prick up, right? Replication is sort of the...
You should. The criticism people have of these kinds of studies, ours in particular, of the omega-3s, that, people who have a high omega-3, they just have lots of healthier habits. They eat better. They don't smoke. They don't weigh as much. They're richer. They're more well-educated, yada, 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 yada. And that's why they do better. It's not because of the omega-3. Well, I don't know how long you can ride that pony, because every study that comes, you have to make that excuse every time for every outcome we found. And to me, it runs out of steam. I think the omega-3s actually are playing a role here.
Definitely.
It's not that they're just markers of a good diet.
No.
They're real.
I mean, we touched on a couple of mechanisms, right? And you can keep going, and there's so many mechanisms at play. I mean, even the vascular function, the endothelial function, that brief little tidbit of a study we explored, that has serious implications if that thread is followed. The cardiovascular thread, if that's followed deeper. It's fascinating. I'm really curious what we learn over the next decade. So as someone who's been in it from the start, and you've seen the evolution of this, and I guess only grown more, more bullish, for lack of a better term. What are you most excited about in the future, where this research goes?
Well, I think that the disease everybody's focusing on these days is Alzheimer's disease, dementia. There's so many people in the baby boomer, cohort, of which I'm one, that are reaching that age where dementia becomes the problem. We've kept people alive, kept their hearts going well. We've kept them better fit. We've kept, by sanitation and clean water and all this stuff, people are living longer. It's not because we're genetically doing any better. In fact, genetically, we're getting worse every generation. Mutation. You're right. That's not, we're not getting better that way. But lifespans are getting longer because of better medical health. And that's beginning to flip nowadays with obesity, et cetera. But in any event, I think that I've lost my train of thought. Where was I going?
Lifespan, healthspan, dementia.
Healthspan, right? Healthspan. Future of where this goes. Yeah. And I was talking about Alzheimer's. Figures I'd forget that, right? Perfect sense. We've got a lot of good circumstantial data. I'd say saying high omega-3 is good for cognitive health, for forestalling. I mean, nobody's going to prevent, in the strict sense, Alzheimer's disease. You're going to die before you get it. That's what you want to do. Okay, so it's not like we're going to, nor do we. Do I think we're ever going to reverse it? Once it's happened, I think it's happened. So all we can do is prevent it, and we don't really know how to prevent it with drugs yet. A lot of money being spent on that, but I think we need a lot more money spent on nutritional and lifestyle things that can be done to prevent it. And so that's a strong effort. Food for the Brain is a foundation in the UK that's working very hard to, just on a symposium with them yesterday, where we talked all things Alzheimer's disease and prevention, non-pharmacologic prevention. I'm excited about that.
It's really fascinating in how omega-3 could play a role in that as well. I mean, things like we were talking last week with Dr. Norm Dawson, who's a fascinating chap who he has a hearing implant, and the whole episode was about the risk of if you're impaired, if your hearing is impaired, the link between developing Alzheimer's and actually if your hearing is impaired, get a hearing aid because it's just a no-brainer as far when it comes to cognitive decline. Yeah, I mean, even things like a sauna, you can reduce your risk factor by up to 66%, says the research. Again,
yeah, well, right. I'm a believer in saunas, but I'm not. It's very hard to do a randomized trial on sauna use.
Okay,
it's one of those. It's a people who study, people who take saunas, people who eat omega-3, people who do this. It's good evidence, it's suggestive evidence. It's hard to prove it, but I think it's good. You mentioned hearing. We do have we're now got accepted abstracts. We've shown that higher omega-3 in the UK Biobank is associated with lower hearing difficulties.
Well, there you go. I mean, that could be an indirect mechanism there.
I mean, right. It's all playing into that nexus of the brain and vision. Of course, dry eye is part of an inflammatory condition, but there are people now being able to see aberrations in the retina of the eye and the nerves that flow out of the retina. You can almost see Alzheimer's disease coming in the eye.
Wow.
The eye is part of the brain. So it's a very interesting, the way we're going to be able to detect incoming or rather impending Alzheimer's or dementia. I think we're going to get better at that. And then we can use those markers as omega-3 connections.
Well, watch this space. Watch this space. I mean, I just want to touch on I was going to ask about the sort of potential fertility benefits of omega-3. But I feel like they're quite downstream, if there are any. They're downstream of inflammation, it seems, especially with the male side of the equation. I'm not sure, are you familiar with this?
What side of omega-3? What side?
Fertility benefits.
Fertility. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I have seen some studies where particularly the donor, the mom egg is more likely to get fertilized. And maybe on the male side too. For some reason, there's almost all the studies on omega-3 and sperm health seem to come out of Iran. I don't know. There's a group there that's real interested in it. Okay. Okay, fine. But that's an interesting field too, where if you could improve the results of in vitro fertilization steps by just improving your nutritional status, that would be huge.
Big time. Big time.
So many people are doing it. Yeah.
Sorry, what was that stat?
Because IVF is becoming so common, and so many people are, waiting to get married and to get pregnant until they're just about out of steam. It's an important medical procedure that if the omega-3s can help, I'd like to see that study too.
Yeah, me too. Well, super exciting where this field goes. Someone who's completely bought into this now. I mean, you always know it's a good podcast when you want to run off immediately and do whatever the conversation was about. I just want to go and fry up a salmon steak. But what do you do personally, Bill? Do you supplement?
I try to eat fish twice a week. Not always successful, but I take about 1,400 milligrams of EPA DHA a day, 2 capsules.
Okay, and what are you looking for in a supplement?
I'm looking for ideally a triglyceride-based supplement. Sometimes they're called restructured triglycerides or re-esterified triglycerides. They're Omega-3s are in a triglyceride form, but they're more concentrated than the raw fish oil would be because they've been chemically enhanced. So that's a good product. Those are more expensive typically because it's more processing to get them there. But I like that kind of product. I like to have EPA and DHA and roughly, it doesn't have to be 50-50, but 40-60, 60-40. I want both of them. I don't want something that's just 100% EPA or 100% DHA. I think they come together in fish all the time. So I think there's a message there.
Which way round? You mentioned so if it was 60-40, what would you want 60, EPA or DHA?
Well, again, whether it's 60% of the omega-3s are DHA and 40% are EPA or vice versa, I'm okay. I don't think we know the exact ratio that you need.
Right. Okay. Understood. And as far as a supplement goes or anything like this, do people have to be concerned about quality? I mean, not all these supplements are created equally, right?
Yeah. I mean, they're not going to be dangerous. Even the cheapest stuff is not dangerous. It's not laced with pollutants and all this stuff, because to get it even passably acceptable from a taste and smell point of view, you got to clean it up a lot. And that cleaning up removes virtually all of those, certainly all the mercury. There's no mercury in fish oils. PCBs and dioxins and things like that are also cleaned up by that process. So I'm not worried about those things. The problem is some of the lower concentrated omega-3 products, say 30% EPA and DHA in a pill, you got to take, 5, 6, 7 of those things a day to get a good, maybe 2,000 milligram dose. And nobody's going to do that. It's just too much. So I like to find a more concentrated one where I can get the omega-3s in 2 pills. Get 1,500 in 2 pills a day. That's great.
Okay, understood. So once we've got the EPA, once we've got the DHA, and they're in a good ratio and they're a substantial sort of quantity, are you capsules or bottle? What would you suggest for people?
Oh, I use capsules. I mean, I've used the liquid. Put it on a teaspoon, drink it before that, and that's fine. I just find it more convenient to take capsules.
Okay, there you go. So, any other parting words on anything the listener should go ahead and do or think about with the caveat of all of this, perhaps?
Well, of course, I've been on the bandwagon for omega-3 index testing for a long time, and I still think that's the most important thing. If you care what your cholesterol level is, for example, you better care what your omega-3 is, because it's more important than your cholesterol level in terms of telling you about your risk for heart disease, for sure. And so if you go to the trouble of getting your cholesterol done, you should have your omega-3.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Bill Harris, thank you so much for doing this. It was an absolute pleasure for me. I really, really enjoyed speaking with you. Where can people keep up to date with what you're up to?
Probably I have a fatty acid research institute, FARI. So if people look at the Fatty Acid Research Institute and go to the About button, you'll see stuff, or just Google my name, William S. Harris, and you'll find my stuff. I don't tweet, X, whatever it's called, and I'm not that good on that stuff, so I haven't got a handle as far as I know.
yeah. Well, if someone follows you, it's not you. So yeah,
right.
Well, maybe we'll have to do this again, and we can get an update on your latest down the road. But thanks so much again. Really enjoyed it. And
you're welcome. Let me know what your omega-3 index comes in at.
Yeah, I will. I'll follow up for sure.
It shows up.
Hopefully really high, but we'll see.
Absolutely. Should be. Well, good. Best to you and Eloise. It's been fun.
Thank you very much, Bill. Cheers. Appreciate that.